In previous years, my husband was always eager to take me to his company's Christmas party. But this year was different. 1 week before the party, he said, without really looking me in the eye, "Don't come to my company's Christmas party. This year, it would be awkward with my ex there." I didn't hesitate. I said, "Of course, I'll stay home." But what he didn't know was that I would still go to that party, not as his wife, but as the new regional director, invited as a surprise guest by his boss. 1 week later, I arrived at the party, imagining how shocked he would be to see me. But not even 5 minutes before that moment, I lost my footing, after accidentally witnessing my husband secretly kissing his ex in the stairwell. I quietly stepped back so they wouldn't notice me. That night, I didn't just reveal an affair. I exposed the secrets that brought their careers crashing down at that very party. But before I tell you their terrible secrets, please hit the like button and comment below the city you're living in. Then I'll tell you everything, right now. I am Michelle, 35 years old, living in Boston, a stay-at-home mom working full-time online. Every morning starts the same. I take my 4-year-old son, Noah, to preschool, watch him run into class, then return home, make a cup of coffee, open my laptop, and log into work. For the past 3 months, I've been working online as the Regional Director of Operations for Elysian Jewelers Group, the same company my husband works for. I oversee operations, supply chains, and performance for the entire Northeast region. No one at the company knows my true identity, not even my husband, Daniel. In his eyes, I'm still just a wife working remotely for my old job, something that has nothing to do with the glamorous world of the jewelry conglomerate where he is a QA manager. 1 week before Christmas, while I was cleaning the kitchen and Daniel was lounging on the sofa scrolling through his phone, he said it so casually, like an offhand reminder. "You shouldn't come to the company's Christmas party. It'll be awkward because of an ex." I didn't ask who the ex was, didn't get jealous, didn't react, didn't try to find out more. I just looked up at him and replied neatly, "Of course, I'll stay home." Daniel exhaled in relief, as if shedding an invisible burden, while I began to memorize every detail of that sentence, from the way he avoided my gaze to the brief pause after the word awkward. That night, once Noah was asleep and the house had fallen quiet, my mind drifted back 5 years. Back then, I was the deputy sales director of a major cosmetics corporation, constantly flying for business, living the fast-paced life I once equated with success. Then, during a work trip, I went into premature labor at 31 weeks. Noah was born with a neonatal infection and spent nearly 4 months in the NIC. I spent more time standing in front of hospital incubators than in boardrooms. And when Noah finally came home, I chose to resign from my high-ranking position to be a mother first. I applied for a role as assistant sales director, a full-time online position, so I could be there for him. Noah grew stronger, but during his early years, he often fell sick with every change in weather, especially with pneumonia every winter. It wasn't until he turned 4 that Noah became almost as healthy as an average child. 6 months ago, watching my son run across the schoolyard, breathing steadily, I decided it was time to return to the workforce. With experience as both a deputy sales director and assistant director, I confidently applied for director-level roles. 3 months ago, I was hired as a regional director at Elysian Jewelers Group, the very company where my husband works. I accepted the terms, working online for the last quarter of the year and keeping my internal identity undisclosed. At the time, I thought it was just a new career opportunity. I didn't expect that very silence to become the perfect shell for the truths I was about to uncover. From the very first week on the job, I forced myself to set aside all personal thoughts and approach the system as someone fully responsible for operations. Each morning, after closing the door behind Noah on his way to school, I would sit down at my desk, log into the Northeast region's central dashboard, where every figure appeared cold, emotionless, impartial. I wasn't investigating anyone, wasn't targeting any individual. I was simply doing my job, reviewing processes, checking data, comparing performance across factories, suppliers, and monthly procurement cycles. At first, everything looked fairly standard, cleaner than I expected even. Reports were neatly presented, growth charts showed steady progress, defect rates were within acceptable limits. But the deeper I dug, the more I sensed something familiar from my past years in the cosmetics industry, that feeling when numbers are too perfect. I began peeling back layers of data, isolating procurement, comparing input prices by quarter, by supplier, by contract. That's when the first irregularities surfaced. There were material costs rising steadily month after month, with no corresponding improvement in quality or output. New suppliers appeared in the system with unusual frequency, despite having little to no prior partnership history. I lingered over those figures longer than necessary, not out of suspicion, but because my professional instincts told me that when there's a procurement issue, what lies beneath is rarely simple. I took notes, created a separate tracking file, marked contracts for review, telling myself this could just be market fluctuation, or maybe process errors. At that point, I had no image of Daniel in my mind, no thoughts of infidelity or betrayal. To me, this was just work, and those newly exposed numbers were like a thin thread, not yet enough to draw conclusions, but enough for me to begin tugging, slowly, cautiously, patiently. I began pulling that thread more slowly, more cautiously, opening each procurement contract in chronological order to understand what was really going on. When I filtered the data starting from the beginning of the year, one detail immediately stood out. 3 new suppliers had appeared almost simultaneously, with a rapidly increasing frequency of collaboration within just a few short months. I separated their profiles, compared their prices to the market average and to those of long-standing suppliers. The numbers stopped me cold. The cost of materials from these 3 partners was 18 to 25% higher than the market, a discrepancy far too great in the world of high-end jewelry, where every percent of cost is meticulously accounted for. I kept going, scrolling down to the contract approval section. One name repeatedly appeared at the very end. Crystal, head of procurement. I clicked into her personnel profile, not out of personal curiosity, but professional responsibility. Crystal had only been hired into this position 11 months ago, not even a year, yet she held full authority over all procurement decisions for the region. That in itself wasn't wrong, but coupled with the unusual pricing, I couldn't look away. When her resume photo appeared on the screen, I froze. That face gave me an odd sense of familiarity I couldn't explain, as if I'd seen her before, in a context completely unrelated to this job. I tried to dig through my memories, search the fragmented images of meetings, parties, or old photographs, but I couldn't place her. The familiarity passed quickly, just enough to grab my attention, but not enough to stop me. I closed Crystal's profile and returned to the contract board, taking notes with clinical precision. At that moment, only one question filled my mind. How could a newly appointed head of procurement push through such inflated contracts without facing any resistance from the system? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew this much. These numbers couldn't exist without at least one other link in the chain. And if I wanted to find it, I had to move away from procurement and step into the quality control domain. I opened the quality feedback logs by batch and cross-checked them with the corresponding QA reports. At first glance, everything still looked clean. No serious complaints, no red flags, no rejection records. Every batch, without exception, was marked pass. Too perfect. So perfect it sent a chill down my spine, because in the high-end jewelry industry, where natural materials inherently carry variance, it's nearly impossible for every batch to meet the standard flawlessly. I kept scrolling down to the final signature line on each QA report. And then, a familiar name began to appear over and over again before my eyes. Daniel, QA manager. I lingered long on that line, not because I was seeing my husband's name, but because, with years of management experience, I knew the weight of that signature. The final QA signature isn't just a formality, it's a legal shield for the entire procurement chain ahead of it. Once that signature is placed, all prior discrepancies are nearly legalized. I forced myself to stay calm, continuing to work like a true operations director. I opened the QA file's metadata, checked the edit history, compared the actual inspection times with the timestamps of when the reports were saved, and that was when the timestamps began to betray their creator. Several QA files showed signs of being edited after the inspection had occurred. Some even altered hours after the goods had already been cleared for warehousing. That cannot happen if the process is properly followed. A QA report is supposed to be a final output, not a document that can be touched up after everything is done. I sat silently in front of the screen, my hand still on the mouse, but clicking nothing. At that moment, I no longer saw scattered numbers. I began to see a systemic loophole where procurement and QA were no longer operating independently, but instead were working together with chilling smoothness. And what unnerved me most wasn't seeing Daniel's name in those reports. It was this undeniable truth. Those edits could not have been accidental. When a process has been deliberately bent, the next thing to look at is always the money. I shifted to the payment system, not rushing, not skipping steps, following each expense line just as I had in high-stakes deals years ago. I filtered by supplier, by month, by shipment batch, then expanded to include service fees I hadn't scrutinized before. And it was within this layer of data that the picture began to sharpen. The payments weren't going directly from Elijah Jewelers Group to the material suppliers, as was standard. Instead, they passed through two intermediary LLCs. The company names sounded perfectly legitimate, with complete tax records and clear office addresses. At a glance, nothing seemed suspicious. But when I cross-checked their founding dates, I discovered both LLCs were established shortly after Crystal was appointed head of procurement. I went on to compare material prices before and after that point, then compiled everything into a single table. The price discrepancies increased month by month, not abruptly, not hastily, but like a plan crafted to avoid detection. I totaled the price gaps over the 11-month period. When the final number appeared on screen, I had to take a deep breath. $2.2 million. Not a bookkeeping error, not market fluctuation, a systematically inflated sum, large enough to shift the course of an internal investigation. I checked each line again, and then a third time, to make absolutely sure I wasn't mistaken. But the numbers didn't change. They were there, cold, precise, unflinching. I clicked into the legal profiles of the two intermediary LLCs. On paper, everything was cleanly arranged. Names of legal representatives, registered addresses, tax IDs, all valid. But when I looked closer, one small detail held my gaze longer than usual. The last name of one legal rep matched Crystal's, and the business address was just a few blocks from the apartment complex she had listed in her personnel file. Not enough for a conclusion, but more than enough to raise my guard. I didn't rush to assumptions. Instead, I sent a brief email to Anna, an old friend from my corporate days who now worked in business law. I asked her a simple favor: no company names, no mention of Crystal, just to check for any links between the two legal entities, if possible. I shut down my laptop and returned to my daily tasks, but in my mind, I was counting every minute that passed. 2 days later, Anna called me back. Her voice lowered from the very first sentence. "Michelle, your suspicion was right." She explained that, through old notarized documents and internal authorization forms, the legal rep of one LLC was a direct relative of Crystal, her cousin. Though this relationship had been deliberately omitted from official business filings, what they did wasn't illegal on paper, but it clearly created a conflict of interest, especially in the context of inflated procurement contracts. I reopened all the data, setting the timeline before and after Crystal's hire. Prior to that, material contracts followed market prices. QA had minor errors, but stayed procedural, and no intermediary LLCs existed. Everything started the moment Crystal took control of procurement. At this point, I no longer felt like I was assembling disconnected fragments. The picture was complete, and I knew then. This was no longer suspicion. This was verified truth. But the most important thing at that time was that the truth still remained within the scope of work. At that point, I hadn't once thought about infidelity. In my mind, Daniel was still my husband, the man who had, for years, shown up in my life as a dedicated QA manager, a responsible father, and the person who once held my hand as we stood before the NICU incubator, night after night, when Noah was still so small. I remember clearly how, in past Christmas seasons, Daniel had always been the one to invite me to the company's year-end party. I had sat beside him in those bright banquet halls, shaken hands with his colleagues, listened to his work stories told with pride. Not once had he shown hesitation or discomfort about having me there. That's why, even now as I faced evidence of fraud, I kept a clear distinction between my role as a wife and my role as an operations director. To me at that point, this was simply a serious case of internal fraud, a procurement QA system manipulated by a conflict of interest that I had the responsibility to handle. I hadn't yet questioned the personal relationship between Daniel and Crystal. Not once had I mentally linked their names together. I believed that if Daniel had done wrong, it was wrong in his professional role. Nothing more. It was that belief that kept me grounded, continuing to collect evidence with a calmness that, in hindsight, I now see not as naivety, but as the final boundary I held for a marriage I still believed was real. That boundary kept me working with a clear head, but that same clarity drove me deeper into the data. I went back to the internal email system, not searching emotionally, but by timestamp. I sorted all correspondence by sending time, separating emails during business hours from those sent outside of them. Within minutes, a clear pattern emerged. Crystal and Daniel exchanged a significant volume of emails after hours. Not brief, informational ones, but long chains, sent late at night, early morning, even on weekends. I opened each email, reading every line carefully. On the surface, the content was still work-related, but the tone wasn't. The opening lines were no longer formal, and the endings weren't simply about task confirmations. I didn't need romantic language to see it, because in a corporate setting, intimacy reveals itself in frequency and timing, not words. I noted overlapping hours, days where both sent unusually late emails, then cross-referenced those with business trip logs and shipment schedules. Next, I pulled up the list of meetings labeled Supplier Evaluation. On the calendar, these were marked as high priority, but when I searched for meeting minutes, there was nothing. No reports, no summaries, no confirmation signatures. The meetings existed on the schedule, but left behind no administrative trace. In a system as tightly standardized as Elysian Jewelers Group, this was nearly unacceptable, unless someone had deliberately let them slip by unnoticed. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the layered timestamps on my screen, feeling something inside me shift. Slowly, quietly, like a hairline crack just beginning to form across glass. I still didn't call it suspicion. I still didn't allow myself to think beyond work. But I knew one thing for certain. When work bleeds outside office hours, when meetings leave no record, the story behind them is rarely just professional. That thought had barely settled when one small, seemingly accidental detail became the final piece that pushed me into another level of awareness. While scanning through the email system to finalize my evidence log, I noticed a personal email that had been mistakenly sent through the work channel. The subject line had nothing to do with business. No project codes, no shipment IDs. It stood out among hundreds of dry, transactional emails like a discordant note in an otherwise perfectly measured score. I opened it. From the very first line, I knew I wasn't reading a work message. The tone of address had changed. No more Crystal or Daniel. Paired with a concise update, there were instead opening lines that were discreetly personal, gently intimate. subtle enough to pass unnoticed by outsiders, but unmistakable to someone like me who had spent years reading corporate emails. I didn't need to read to the end to know what was going on, but I read it all anyway, line by line, in silence. I checked the timestamp. Then I reopened Crystal's personnel file and matched it to her hiring date. Everything aligned with chilling precision. The first personal email appeared after Crystal was hired, and the frequency of messages increased in tandem with inflated contracts, altered QA reports, and the emergence of intermediary LLCs. This wasn't a pre-existing affair. It wasn't a years-long secret. This was a relationship born and grown in parallel with fraud. I sat still before the screen for a long time, not crying, not angry, not even shocked the way I once imagined I'd be if I ever discovered betrayal. What came instead was a cold, clear-headed realization. In this story, the affair wasn't the cause. It was the catalyst. It lubricated bad decisions, concealed illegal signatures, and turned a system that was meant to be transparent into fertile ground for deception. In that moment, I understood clearly. The affair and the fraud had walked hand in hand, and neither was an accident. As that truth settled within me, one seemingly small detail suddenly found its place, so clearly that I no longer needed to speculate. I reopened the internal information about this year's Christmas party, the guest list, seating chart, departmental representatives, and my eyes stopped at a familiar name: Crystal. This was the first year she would be attending the Christmas party as head of procurement, not just a peripheral staff member, but someone seated among the leadership. And it was also this year, for the first time in our entire marriage, that Daniel told me it would be awkward if I attended. In previous years, when I'd gone with him to these year-end gatherings, he'd never once seemed hesitant or uncomfortable. No warnings, no excuses, no distance. Back then, everything in his work life had been functioning normally. No irregular procurement contracts, no suspicious QA edits, and no new outsider stepping into a sensitive position like Crystal's. Crystal had only been hired less than a year. She was someone from outside who entered the system, and her relationship with Daniel had only formed within that same time frame. A young relationship, bound tightly to financial interests, yet still too fragile to withstand the scrutiny of those who knew Daniel personally. It wasn't about an ex, and it wasn't about the past, but about a present that wasn't yet safe from being exposed. In that moment, I understood clearly that Daniel wasn't afraid I'd get jealous. He was afraid I'd notice. Notice the small changes in how he stood next to another woman, the awkwardness not yet rehearsed, the gestures that a wife who has lived with him long enough could sense instinctively. And precisely because the relationship was still vulnerable, still not well hidden, the order to keep me away from this year's Christmas party became essential to him. I closed my screen and sat quietly for a few seconds, feeling not an eruption, but a strange calm. At that moment, I knew I didn't need to arrive early. I didn't need to say a word. I just had to wait for the right moment, when the lights they were trying to avoid would be forced to come on, and all those flimsy shields would no longer be enough to hide behind. That thought didn't lead me to act like a betrayed wife, but with the clarity of someone used to standing before major decisions. I didn't speak to Daniel. Not a question, not a probing look, not a single hint. At dinners afterward, I still sat across from him, asked about Noah, talked about the weather, about our son's school schedule, as if no other truth existed in my mind. I didn't question Crystal either, though I could have summoned her in my capacity as regional director, asked formal questions, and forced her to respond. But I understood that confronting too early would immediately trigger their defense mechanisms, and I didn't want them to be on the defensive. Not yet. I needed them to continue believing everything was still normal. I hadn't even informed senior leadership, not because I lacked evidence, but because I was waiting for a moment when the truth could no longer be twisted or bargained with. Instead, I worked in silence. I collected, categorized, and locked all the evidence systematically. Every email was saved with a timestamp. Every contract was clearly marked before and after Crystal's appointment. The edited QA reports were preserved with their original metadata. The financial flows through the intermediary LLCS were cross-checked and compiled into a single, comprehensive table. I created separate folders, labeled them by date, backed them up onto an independent secure drive, and printed out essential hard copies, as though preparing for an audit only I knew was coming. The more I worked, the more I realized that what mattered wasn't how much evidence I had, but where it was placed and how it was revealed. A truth told at the wrong time can be dismissed as personal emotion, but a truth presented on the right stage becomes a conclusion in itself. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed everything to be seen at once, under lights they couldn't turn off. In that moment, I knew I was ready. Not to confront in the living room or bedroom, but to step into a space where I held enough authority, enough proof, and enough composure to speak the truth. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was preparing a stage where every action would stand exactly where it belonged, and where my silence all this time would finally have a reason to exist. And that evening, I drove to the Christmas party venue earlier than planned. According to the arrangement made in advance with the regional CEO, I didn't enter through the main hall, didn't appear under the lights, or among the clinking glasses and congratulatory laughter. I took the service entrance, used only by staff and organizers, where everything moved quickly, quietly, and no one paid attention to a simply dressed woman like me. The atmosphere backstage was entirely different. There were no Christmas carols, no wine glasses, just hurried footsteps on tile and whispered conversations. I stepped aside to let a few servers pass, then turned into the internal stairwell that connected the office floors with the event area. And it was there, under the dim yellow hallway light, that I saw them. Daniel and Crystal stood close, too close to be just colleagues. There were no showy kisses, no hurried gestures, just a brief moment where they leaned into each other, lips meeting for a fleeting second, like a habit already rehearsed many times before. It happened silently, discreetly, and if I hadn't been there, it might have passed without leaving a trace. I didn't step forward, didn't cough, didn't drop anything to draw attention. I simply took out my phone and captured a single photo. No dramatic zoom, no need for multiple angles, just their faces, the stairwell setting, and the timestamp displayed clearly on the screen. I checked the photo once, turned off the screen, and tucked the phone into my coat pocket like I had just completed a minor task on my to-do list. Then I turned and walked away the same way I came, slowly, unhurried. Daniel and Crystal had no idea I had been there. No idea that the moment they thought invisible had been recorded, not for jealousy or confrontation, but to become the final piece in a nearly complete puzzle. As I exited the service area, the Christmas music from the main hall grew louder, mingling with the laughter inside. I took a deep breath, adjusted my coat, and knew that when I stepped into the light in just a few minutes, this story would no longer remain in the dark. As I stepped out of the service area, the Christmas lights in the main hall were glowing brightly. The music played just loud enough, and the clinking of wine glasses created the familiar soundscape of a year-end party. People stood in small groups, chatting and laughing cheerfully, unaware that in just a few minutes, the entire atmosphere would change. Then the regional CEO stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, his voice deep and clear. The music faded. Conversations gradually came to a halt, as if the entire room was returning to a shared breath. He began with a few end-of-year congratulations, thanking departments for making it through a turbulent year, then paused briefly. "Tonight, we have a special guest," he said, his gaze shifting toward the side aisle of the stage. "Someone who has been working silently all this time, and who will officially be introduced to the leadership of the Northeast region starting today." That person was Michelle, the new regional director of Elysian Jewelers Group. As he read my name, I stepped out, slowly, unhurried, avoiding no one's gaze. I saw Daniel freeze in place. His face went pale, eyes wide open, so shocked he seemed no longer himself. The woman he'd believed to be just a wife working from home now stood there, under the lights, as a regional director of the very company he worked for. I didn't look at him long, but I saw enough. The moment of realization collapsing every ounce of confidence he'd brought with him that evening. I nodded to the CEO, turned to face the audience, and spoke no lengthy introduction. I signaled to the tech team. The large screen behind the stage lit up. The stairwell photo appeared first, clear, uncaptioned. The room's energy changed instantly. Whispering dwindled, then vanished. I let the image linger for a few seconds, long enough for everyone to understand this was no mistake. Then I moved to the second slide. A series of emails magnified, showing only the portions that revealed conflicts of interest and after-hours correspondence. No emotional commentary, just dates, email addresses, and the work context blurred by exchanges that were no longer purely professional. Then came the procurement contracts, each figure highlighted, each price compared to market rates. I pointed out the discrepancies, step by step, just as I had done in operations meetings. The final slide was stark. A single number centered on the screen, $2.2 million over 11 months. No color, no effects. Just the number, with a brief caption explaining the method of price inflation through intermediary entities. I paused, letting silence do its work. In that moment, there was no music, no clinking glasses, only eyes locked on the screen, and faces beginning to realize this wasn't a personal drama, but a truth that could no longer be ignored. As I stepped away from the microphone, the CEO returned to the stage, his face no longer wearing the polite smile of a festive evening. His voice dropped, firm and decisive. Before the entire regional leadership and staff, he announced that Crystal was immediately suspended from duty, effective on the spot, to cooperate with an investigation. No arguments, no opportunity to explain. Crystal stood motionless for a few seconds, then bowed her head and quietly left the center of the room, under the heavy gaze of those who had been toasting her just minutes earlier. Immediately after, the CEO called Daniel's name. No one in the room needed to ask why. He announced that all of Daniel's QA system access was revoked and that he was suspended from his managerial role pending the outcome of the investigation. I watched Daniel step forward briefly, then stop, as if his legs no longer obeyed him. His face turned ashen, arms limp, eyes scanning the room with nowhere to land. The man who had once confidently signed off every pass report now stood stripped of any power to defend himself. The CEO didn't stop there. He announced the activation of an independent audit with participation from an external accounting firm and a comprehensive internal investigation into the supply chain and QA department over the past 11 months. Every related contract would be reviewed from scratch. All transactions involving intermediary entities would be frozen for verification. His words rang out, clear, structured, as if the decisions had long been prepared, waiting only for the right moment to be declared. In that room, I witnessed two collapses unfold at once. One was professional, public, irreversible. The other was the collapse of a marriage I once believed to be safe. Strangely, I didn't feel shaken or dizzy. I stood still, back straight, fully aware that from this moment forward, the story no longer belonged to emotion. It had become a matter of accountability, legality, and justice, and I had placed it exactly where it needed to be seen. From that night on, my life shifted to a completely new rhythm. On the first workday of the new year, I officially arrived at the office as the Regional Director of Operations, no longer a name hidden behind a laptop screen. I walked through departments, met face-to-face with people who had only known me through emails these past 3 months, and dove into the work I had long been preparing for, restructuring the entire supply chain. All vendors were reevaluated from scratch, QA protocols were tightened, and all purchasing decisions required cross-verification. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the company began to stabilize, like a body recovering from major trauma. In the afternoons, I still left the office on time to pick up Noah. I was still his mother, still listening to his stories about school, his drawings, his endless questions that only a child could ask. But one thing had changed forever. I was no longer blind. I no longer lived in a marriage where the truth was buried under soothing words or half-truths. I moved forward more lightly now, even if the path ahead was far from easy. Legally, everything unfolded exactly as the evidence had shown. Daniel and Crystal were prosecuted for organized fraud and falsifying internal records. Both were ordered to return the full $2.2 million, along with the company's audit and legal costs. Crystal's assets were seized to fulfill civil obligations. Her home, the car she once proudly owned, and even her retirement savings. Daniel was sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanently banned from holding any roles related to QA, compliance, or quality management in the future. Crystal received a 4-year suspended sentence and was barred from working in procurement, the very field that once launched her career. I didn't celebrate those sentences. I simply acknowledged them as the natural consequence. This wasn't a personal victory. It was the closing of an old chapter, one in which my silence had been mistaken for weakness. Now, standing in my new office, looking out at Boston in the chill of early January, I knew exactly where I stood and why I was there. My new chapter didn't begin with revenge. It began with clarity, transparency, and the freedom I had reclaimed for myself. 3 months later, I finalized the divorce. The court granted me full custody of Noah, based on the stability of our life and what was best for him. Daniel, after serving his sentence, would still have visitation rights, but under supervision, as required. Everything happened quietly. No shouting, no prolonged battles. I signed the final papers with a feeling that was very different from what I had once imagined. Not pain, not triumph, just relief. 1 year passed since that company Christmas party. Tonight, I stood by the window, looking out at Boston, lit up after Christmas. The city was the same, the familiar streets, the golden glow reflected in the windows, people slowly making their way home after a long year. Noah slept soundly in the room next door. I could hear his steady breathing and realized some kinds of peace only arrive after one dares to face the truth. I understood something very clearly. Silence is not weakness. It is waiting for the right moment. Sometimes, speaking too soon only shatters everything. But when truth is placed in the right time, the right place, it carries its own weight, without needing justification. That Christmas night, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost an illusion, a life I once thought was safe, but had been built on things I never knew. And on that same night, I reclaimed my life, as a clear-eyed mother, an independent woman, and a human being no longer living in the shadow of concealment. When Daniel no longer appeared in this house, I thought my son and I would finally find peace. But we didn't. I began to notice a very small, yet persistent change in Noah. He spoke less. His innocent questions came less frequently. He no longer rushed to the door every time a car passed outside. In the evenings, he sat alone longer, sometimes just staring out the window without saying a word. I didn't ask him too many questions. I just quietly observed, like a mother who's learned from far too many moments of fear. I took Noah to see a child therapist. In the bright room full of toys, he followed directions, answered when prompted, but I could see he was holding something back. On the drive home, Noah suddenly smiled as he looked down at the front steps, where the neighbor's little dog often lay in the sun each afternoon. He sat down very slowly, reached out his hand, as if afraid of startling someone. His eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. In that moment, I understood. Noah didn't need long explanations. He needed a friend who would stay, who wouldn't disappear, who wouldn't leave him wondering what he had done wrong. A friend who only needed to be present, every day, in the same place. That weekend, I took Noah to an animal shelter on the outskirts of Boston. It was quieter than I had expected. Rows of cages lined the space, each animal carrying a story I didn't need to fully know. Noah walked very slowly, holding my hand, until he stopped at the very end of the row. Inside was a German shepherd, with a brown and black coat, alert ears, and calm, gentle eyes. Noah said nothing. He simply reached out his hand and smiled, softly, as if he had known the dog before. The dog approached, sat down, and rested its head against the bars. No barking, no leaping, just a quiet moment I knew I would never forget. I filled out the adoption papers that same day. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was fate, but everything happened faster than I expected. When we brought the dog home, Noah didn't leave its side for a second. He played with it on the living room floor, tossed a ball, laughed aloud, the sound I had missed for so many months. That night, when I walked into his room, Noah was already asleep, arms wrapped tightly around the dog, his breathing steady, his face, for the first time in a long time, truly at peace. I'm truly curious. If you were me, standing on that stairwell that night, and saw your husband kissing another woman, what would you have done? Comment 1 if you would have, stormed up, shouted, demanded an explanation on the spot. Or comment 2 if you're like me, stayed silent, turned away, gathered the facts, and let them face the consequences through irrefutable legal action. Let me tell you, there is no wrong answer. It's simply about how you choose to protect yourself. If this story made you reflect, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with a woman you care about. Because maybe she too is standing before a choice and needs to know that sometimes silence is the greatest power of all.